Welcome to the deep dive.
Great to be here.
This is your shortcut to really getting a handle on complex topics. We take a whole stack of sources, articles, research, our own notes.
Yeah, all the good stuff.
And we pull out the most important nuggets, the key insights, basically giving you those aha moments without drowning in all the info.
Cutting through the noise.
Exactly. Today we're diving into someone really fascinating. A figure whose ideas, even though they're from the 14th century, feel incredibly relevant now. Ibn Khaldun.
He really does, doesn't he?
Yeah.
It's quite amazing how some thinkers just resonate across centuries.
Yeah, this is a deep dive that really promises to shed some light on why societies rise and fall.
The big questions.
What holds them together, what pulls them apart. It feels very current.
It does. And Ibn Khaldun, he's absolutely one of those pivotal figures. His legacy is, well, it's very much alive, especially in Tunisia where he was born.
Oh, really? How so?
Well, you find his face on the Tendinar note. There's a big statue of him on Avenue Bourguiba in Tunis.
Wow.
There's even an Ibn Khaldun hotel, a popular stamp. He's become this powerful symbol.
A symbol of what, exactly?
Sort of a symbol of continuity, maybe, between tradition and innovation. Some people even call it a kind of acceptable modern-day ʿAsabiyyah of nationalism.
ʿAsabiyyah. We'll definitely need to unpack that term later.
Oh, absolutely. It's key. But, while he's this potent symbol now, it's really crucial for us to understand him in his own time.
Right. Not just project our modern ideas onto him.
Exactly. We need to avoid seeing him as this sort of orphaned modern thinker who just happened to live back then. We have to be careful about what some scholars call sympathetic Orientalism.
What's that?
It's sort of expecting historical figures from other cultures to perfectly match up with our modern values or standards. It's not fair to them, and it doesn't help us understand them accurately.
I see. So this deep dive is about both things, his relevance and his context.
Precisely. We want to explore both his enduring impact and the really rich, often chaotic world that shaped him and his ideas.
Okay, great. And the heart of that legacy, the core of his thought, is this massive work, the Muqaddimah, right? The Introduction to History.
That's the one. Monumental.
Now, that title, Introduction to History, it might sound a bit dry to some listeners, like just another chronicle of events.
Yeah, but it's anything but dry. It wasn't just recounting what happened, not at all. It's really seen as a foundational text for understanding human society itself.
Foundational, how so?
Well, its ambition was just huge for the 14th century. He wasn't just narrating events. He was trying to analyze the rules, the underlying patterns of history.
Rules and patterns, like a science of history.
Exactly. He essentially set out to found a new science, or what he called a science of civilization. The term he used was ʿUmrān.
ʿUmrān, okay. Another key term.
Yep. So as we get into this, we'll be wrestling with the big questions he tackled.
Like
what really drives the rise and fall of empires, not just back then, but universally.
Okay.
And how do cities and tribal groups interact? How do they shape each other?
Yeah.
It's a constant dynamic, he observed.
The city versus the desert, almost.
Sort of, yeah. Rural versus urban, and what keeps societies cohesive? What's the glue? Or, conversely, what causes them to fragment and fall apart?
Right. So we'll be exploring themes like this ʿAsabiyyah thing.
Group solidarity, yeah.
His idea of history moving in cycles.
Birth, growth, decay.
The whole nature of civilization, ʿUmrān. And his unique way of actually doing history, his historiography.
Absolutely. What's just revolutionary, really, is how he tried to explain not just what happened, but the deep why behind it all.
He wanted the underlying laws.
Yes. He wasn't satisfied with just telling the story. He was digging for those universal laws, the currents flowing beneath the surface of society. He thought this kind of systematic science would give historians the tools,
Tools for what?
Tools to tell the difference between what's credible and what's just legend. A rigorous method for analyzing how human societies actually work. He was, you could say, obsessed with understanding the real mechanics of power in society.
Okay, that sounds essential. So to really get his ideas, we need to understand the man and his world first.
Definitely. Context is everything here.
All right, let's dive into that. Ibn Khaldun, the man, the world he lived in. To really get why his ideas were so groundbreaking, we need this background.
Absolutely. So he was born May 27, 1332, in Tunis.
Tunis, okay.
And he came from quite an aristocratic family, originally from Al-Andalus, Islamic Spain, the Banu Khaldun.
Ah, so they were refugees, in a sense.
You could say that. His ancestors had fled Seville, probably during the Reconquista, the Christian expansion. So this family history, this experience of displacement, of losing power, it likely gave him an early sense of how impermanent things could be.
That makes sense. You see your family history, you see empires shift.
Exactly. And the world he was born into. It was this incredibly fractured, late medieval Islamic world.
Fractured how?
Well, think about the timing. It's sort of sandwiched between two massive events. The fall of the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad to the Mongols in 1258.
Which was a huge blow, right? The end of that Central Islamic Empire.
A devastating blow. And then on the other side, you have the very beginnings of major Ottoman expansion, which would eventually lead to them taking Constantinople in 1453.
So he's living in this in-between period, no single dominant power.
Pretty much. It wasn't a time of stability or unity. It was more like a mosaic of regional powers. You had the Hafsids in Tunis, where he grew up, the Marinids over in Fez, the Zayanids in Tlemcen.
All in North Africa.
Right. All vying for power, constantly shifting alliances. They were connected by culture, religion, sure, but politically. It was constant struggle. Imagine a world where loyalty is flexible. Alliances change overnight.
Sounds pretty chaotic.
It was. That was the backdrop for his entire life.
And his personal life wasn't exactly calm either, was it? The Black Death.
Oh, the plague. It hit him incredibly hard. We're talking 1348, 1349. It swept across the known world, and Tunis was hit badly.
And he lost family.
He lost his father, his mother, and, tragically, many of his relatives and his teachers. Just wiped out.
God, that's horrific.
He described it in almost apocalyptic terms. And interestingly, he didn't just see it as some random disaster. He linked it to urban overcrowding and decay.
Ah, so that connects to his later ideas about cities.
Absolutely. This devastating personal loss, seeing society unravel, it definitely fueled his, let's say, ambiguous thoughts about city life. His skepticism about whether dense urban living was sustainable or even healthy.
Did the plague have wider effects, too?
Oh, massive effects. It was so severe, it actually forced changes in Islamic inheritance law.
Why?
Because entire families were just gone. No clear heirs. Society had to adapt legally to this massive demographic shock. It reshaped things at a fundamental level.
Wow. Okay. So amid all this chaos and tragedy, how did he get his education? Was it formal?
His education was actually remarkably unique, quite independent for the time. He wasn't just stuck in one institution. In fact, he was pretty critical of the formal schools, the official madrasas that were popping up.
Why was he critical?
He saw them as new instruments of power, basically funded by rulers to push specific viewpoints, specific interpretations of law or theology, instruments of control.
Right. So what did he do instead?
He had the freedom, the privilege really, to choose his own teachers, anyone who'd take him on. He studied with leading scholars across an amazing range of fields.
Like what?
Islamic law, obviously, but also history, medicine, literature, math, philosophy, a really broad spectrum. And he got ijazas from them.
What are ijazas?
They're essentially recommendation letters, or more like licenses to teach that subject yourself. Proof of mastery under a recognized scholar.
So he collected these qualifications across disciplines.
Yes, and he made a point of going back to the original sources. For example, in Islamic law, he studied the original rulings and opinions of Imam Malik himself, not just later commentaries or summaries.
That sounds like a very critical, independent approach.
It absolutely was. And this independent, wide-ranging, critical way of learning, it undoubtedly cultivated the unique perspective he brought to his later work. He could connect dots, see patterns across fields that someone with a narrower education might miss.
Okay, so he has this incredible education shaped by this turbulent world. What happens next? Does he become a scholar right away?
Not exactly.
Yeah.
He actually plunged right into a political career.
Yeah.
And it was, well, it was as long and varied as it was bumpy.
Bumpy how? Court politics.
Very much so. He was a statesman, a judge, a scholar, but always navigating these treacherous political waters, moving between the courts in North Africa and even back in Al-Andalus for a time, the Hafsids, Marinids, Zayanids. Wherever there was power, he seemed to be nearby.
What kind of roles did he have?
He started pretty young, as a counselor to the ruler in Fez, so getting that first-hand look at how power works or doesn't work.
And you said it was pumpy. Did he run into trouble?
Oh, yeah. There's a famous story where he was imprisoned in Fez for about a year, 1357 to 58.
Imprisoned?
The Sultan, Abu Inan, basically saw him as a threat. Ibn Khaldun was friends with a rival prince, and in that kind of environment, suspicion was high.
So just being friends with the wrong person could land you in jail?
Pretty much. The story goes he wrote this long poem, 100 lines, from prison, pleading his case. Apparently, it worked eventually. He got out.
Wow. That must have given him some insights into power.
You bet.
Yeah.
These direct experiences, seeing what he called the upwelling and decline of dynastic ambitions up close, he explicitly said this formed the basis of his philosophy of history.
He lived
He
it.
really did. He understood the perils inherent in holding high office, the betrayals, the instability. There's another telling moment later on.
Yeah.
Sultan Muhammad offered him a really top job, Chamberlain. Very prestigious, very powerful.
And he took it.
Nope, he declined. Said he wanted to return to his scientific studies, but he also clearly sensed the danger in that position. So, pragmatically, he suggested they appoint his younger brother, Yahya, instead.
Interesting. Protecting himself, maybe?
Possibly. But also, maybe a genuine realization that he could understand power better by studying it than by wielding it directly, especially in such a risky position. He needed distance.
And that desire for distance, for study, that leads to the Muqaddimah, right? His retreat.
Exactly. This is the pivotal moment for his masterpiece. Around 1375, he basically steps away from the political chaos.
Where did he go?
He retreated to this remote place called Ibn Salama. It was a fortress out in the countryside, and he was under the protection of a local tribe, the Alad Arif.
A kind of self-imposed exile.
You could call it a hermitage. It lasted about 4 years, and it was transformative.
What was it like there?
He described being inspired by the silence of the countryside and by observing the way of life of the nomadic Arif tribe, their ruggedness, their solidarity.
Ah, that ʿAsabiyyah again.
Right there in front of him. And it was in this quiet, reflective space that he started the first draft of the Muqaddimah. It apparently just poured out of him a torrent of words and ideas.
So the retreat wasn't just escaping. It was about deep work.
Absolutely. It was about understanding the world more deeply, precisely because he had that distance. It's interesting, his father was apparently quite devout, maybe a Sufi, and sought solitude for spiritual reasons, for union with God.
But Ibn Khaldun had a different goal.
Yeah. He used his solitude, as one scholar put it, in the service of ambition. Not personal political ambition anymore, but intellectual ambition, to truly understand power, to figure out the rules of the game. He needed that space to synthesize everything he'd seen and lived through.
That makes sense. So after this period of intense writing, did he stay retreated?
No. His life took another turn. He ended up in Cairo.
Cairo, that must have been a huge change from the fortress.
Huge. Cairo was a major center then, intellectually, politically. He became a prominent figure there, taught at the famous Al-Azhar University, headed up some Sufi centers.
So back in the thick of things, in a way.
Definitely. And he was appointed Maliki chief Qadi, a top judge, several times.
Several times. Why not just once?
Well, that's the thing. His appointments never lasted long.
Why not?
Apparently because of his rigor and incorruptibility, he took the job seriously, applied the law strictly, and that rubbed powerful people the wrong way. He kept getting caught up in the mundane politics of Cairo, the court intrigue.
So his integrity was his downfall, politically speaking.
It seems that way. A cycle of being recognized for his brilliance, appointed, then pushed out because he wouldn't play the political games. It's almost a perfect illustration of the kind of dynastic instability he wrote about.
Life imitating art, or theory in his case.
Something like that. And then there's maybe the most famous incident from his later life. His encounter with Tamerlane.
Tamerlane, the conqueror.
The very one, Tamerlane. This was in Damascus around 1401. Tamerlane's army was besieging the city. It was a terrifying situation.
What did Ibn Khaldun do?
He showed incredible guts and diplomacy. He actually went over the city walls, met with Tamerlane, and basically skillfully argued for his life and safety. And not just that, he apparently offered his services, shared his knowledge of North Africa.
Wow, that took nerve.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But what's really fascinating for us is that Ibn Khaldun looked at Tamerlane's powerful conquering army.
Yeah.
And he saw it as a living example, a culmination of his own theory of ʿAsabiyyah, this raw tribal solidarity harnessed by a powerful leader conquering empires. It was his theory made real right before his eyes.
That must have been intellectually validating, even if terrifying.
You'd think so. Yet, even with all this understanding, he could still miscalculate.
Oh.
Later on, back in Cairo, he rashly signed a fatwa, a legal opinion, against the ruling Sultan Barquq. He seems to have judged that Barquq's power, his dynasty's ʿAsabiyyah, was fading.
Because he was wrong.
He was wrong. Barquq proved more resilient than he thought, bounced back, and Ibn Khaldun ended up demoted and isolated. It was a direct personal consequence of misreading the very dynastic forces of the ʿAsabiyyah that he understood better than perhaps anyone else.
So even the master theorist could get it wrong in practice.
It seems so. It highlights the gap between theory and the messy reality of politics.
So, okay, wrapping up this part on his life, what's the big takeaway for us listening now?
I think it's that his personal experiences surviving the plague, navigating treacherous politics, retreating to reflect, they weren't just things that happened to him.
They were fuel for his ideas.
Exactly. They were the raw material, the data for his groundbreaking insights into how societies function, how they rise, and why they fall. He turned a life of intense upheaval into profound, lasting intellectual work. It kind of reminds you that deep understanding often comes from wrestling with difficult lived experiences.
That's powerful. Okay, let's move from the man to the ideas themselves. All right, let's get into the core concepts. And we have to start with ʿAsabiyyah, right? You've mentioned it a few times. It seems absolutely central.
Oh, completely central. It's probably his most famous concept, ʿAsabiyyah.
How do we translate that, roughly?
It's tricky. It gets translated as group solidarity, sometimes esprit de corps, social cohesion, group feeling. None of them quite capture it perfectly.
Why is it hard to translate?
Well, interestingly, he never gave one single neat definition himself.
Really? For his most important concept?
Yeah, which probably means the underlying idea was pretty familiar or known in his time. People just kind of understood what it meant. The word itself comes from the Arabic root asab.
Asab.
Yeah, it means something like to bind or to tie together. So it gives you this immediate sense of being bound together, one tribe, one body, one force. A really tight-knit group.
Okay, so it's this binding force, this group solidarity, and he saw this as the key to history.
Pretty much, yeah. He saw ʿAsabiyyah as the primary explanation for the rise of empires, rulers, and dynasties. It was, for him, the fundamental driving force of history.
The engine.
Exactly. He explained how this really strong, sometimes kind of raw affinity you find in tribal groups, how it could be harnessed and unified.
Harnessed by what?
By a charismatic leader, maybe a religious prophet, or sometimes it's just the circumstances of history, like facing a common enemy. When that happens, this solidarity creates incredible momentum.
How important was it compared to other factors, like military strength or resources?
Hugely important. He basically said tribal solidarity was more important than any of the other reasons he listed. That includes luck, having enough food and supplies, the number of soldiers, even celestial intervention. For winning wars and holding on to power, ʿAsabiyyah was paramount.
Wow. More important than the size of your army.
That's what he argued, because it creates that willingness to fight and die for the group. And here's a really interesting point he made.
Yeah.
ʿAsabiyyah isn't strictly about blood ties, not necessarily literal family lineage in the way we might think today.
It's not.
He explicitly said it can be based on the appearance or the feeling of a common lineage, and that could be just as effective as actual shared ancestry.
So shared experiences could create it. Facing danger together, alliances.
Exactly. Shared experiences, having common enemies, making alliances, all these things can forge powerful āsabiyyah. He even observed that whole groups of people with a common enemy will often construct a common lineage as a way of solidifying a useful alliance.
That sounds very relevant today. Creating us versus them narratives to build group identity.
It's incredibly relevant. It shows how collective identity is often actively built, not just passively inherited. It's about that shared feeling, that common purpose, maybe even a shared story or myth.
Okay, so it's this powerful group feeling. Did he distinguish between different types of āsabiyyah, like if it was based on religion versus just worldly goals?
Yes, he did.
Yeah.
And it was a really important distinction for him. He talked about how religious inspiration could give a dynasty another power, something extra, on top of the basic group feeling.
How would religion add power?
He thought a shared religious belief helped people overcome their mutual jealousy and envy, the internal rivalries that can tear groups apart. Instead, they achieve a concentration upon the truth, a focus on a higher shared goal.
So it unifies them more deeply.
Right. It creates this unified outlook where people are genuinely willing to die for their objectives. He saw the early Islamic conquests as a prime example of this, that religious fervor creating unmatched cohesion and drive.
And how did that compare to purely worldly dynasties?
He contrasted it sharply. Worldly dynasties, he argued, their purposes differ. They're driven more by individual ambition, factional interests, not some universal truth. So when things get tough, they're more likely to abandon each other out of fear of death. Their solidarity is more fragile.
So for Ibn Khaldun, religion could create a stronger, more enduring form of āsabiyyah.
Potentially, yes. It offered a way to transcend some of the inherent human tendencies towards infighting and self-preservation that could undermine purely worldly power.
Okay, āsabiyyah is clearly crucial. Let's move to the next big concept you mentioned, ʿUmrān. You said it means something like the science of civilization.
Yeah, ʿUmrān can be translated as human social organization or his science of civilization. It was his framework for systematically studying how societies are structured, how they develop, how they function.
And what was central to the science for him?
A really key part of his ʿUmrān was this dualistic view he had, contrasting two fundamental modes of life: Bedouinism, or rural civilization, and Hadara, which is urban civilization.
Bedouinism versus Hadara, okay. How did he see the Bedouins, the rural side?
He described Bedouins as these hardy tribes, living tough lives, often on the edge of survival. Importantly, he saw them as being remote from the corruption and excess of urban life.
So he admired them in a way.
Very much so. For him, Bedouinism wasn't just some alternative way of life. He saw it as the cause, the source of civilization itself.
The source?
He believed Bedouins were closer to the first natural state of humanity. They retained a kind of moral toughness, a simplicity that city dwellers lost. Because of this, they were also more easily cured of moral failings if they slipped up. The desert, or the rural environment, was the basis and reservoir of civilization in cities.
The reservoir, like where the energy comes from.
Exactly. It's where that raw āsabiyyah originates, the vitality that eventually builds cities and creates new dynasties.
Okay, so if Bedouinism is the pure source, what about Hadara, urban civilization? Was that the goal?
It was sort of the natural outcome, the goal for successful Bedouin groups who gained power. But here's the paradox in his thinking.
Yeah.
Hadara, urban life, while it represented the peak of development in one sense, was also the last stage of civilization and the point where it begins to decay.
Decay. So success leads to ruin. That seems counterintuitive, especially for us today. We tend to see cities as the pinnacle.
It absolutely is counterintuitive to a lot of modern, especially Western thinking. And that's what makes him so interesting. He saw that urban life brings prosperity, sure. It leads to specialized jobs, more comfort, eventually great luxury.
Sounds good so far.
But he warned about the downsides. This raises a really important question he forces us to confront. Does all that prosperity and density inevitably lead to problems? For Ibn Khaldun, the answer was yes. He argued it fosters immorality, wrongdoing, insincerity, and trickery.
Wow. Harsh judgment on city life.
It was. He even quoted the Quran, referencing verses about God destroying communities where people lived in excessive luxury and became wicked.
So this totally flips the script on the usual view of progress, where cities are always seen as better.
Completely. Thinkers in the Western tradition, going back to Aristotle, and even contemporaries in the Islamic world like Ibn Rushd, generally saw urban life as inherently superior, the ideal place for human flourishing. Ibn Khaldun fundamentally challenged that. He argued for the value, the necessity, the regenerative power of rural civilization. He saw the city as eventually corrupting the very virtues that allowed it to be built.
That's a radical perspective. Okay, this idea of urban decay leads us right into his cyclical theory of history, doesn't it? This idea that dynasties, empires, they rise and fall like living things.
Precisely. It's one of his most famous and influential ideas, this central thesis that dynasties, states, empires, they follow a predictable, almost organic cycle: birth, growth, peak, decline, and eventual death or replacement.
And he thought this cycle had a typical lifespan.
He did. He estimated it usually lasted, at best, 4 generations. He calculated that as roughly 120 years based on average lifespans and how long it took for the founding spirit to dissipate.
4 generations. That's not very long in the grand scheme of things.
Yeah.
How did he see this cycle playing out?
Well, it starts with a rise. A new dynasty emerges, usually from those simple tribal beginnings we talked about, driven by that strong, fresh āsabiyyah from the rural periphery.
They conquer the existing, maybe decadent power.
Exactly. The new ruler initially governs using this powerful group solidarity. It's the foundation of his authority. Then comes the flourish. The dynasty consolidates power, things stabilize, cities grow, wealth increases, luxury and comfort start to develop.
The peak.
Right. But then, inevitably, comes the decline.
What triggers the decline? Is it just the luxury?
That's a huge part of it. The first sign is the softening of āsabiyyah. That toughness, that willingness to sacrifice, that shared purpose forged in hardship gets eroded by the easy life, the sedentary culture, the luxury. People get comfortable. Yes. Then the second phase kicks in. the ruler's alienation.
Yeah.
The ruler, or his descendants maybe in the second or third generation, starts to distrust the very tribesmen, the kinsmen, whose ʿAsabiyyah brought the dynasty to power.
Why? Fear being overthrown by them?
Exactly. He sees them as potential rivals. So he tries to dispense with ʿAsabiyyah. He pushes his own kin away and starts relying on other friends, not of his own kin.
Like hiring mercenaries. Or bringing in administrators from outside the core group.
Precisely. He builds a new power base loyal only to him personally, often using money rather than shared solidarity. But this fatally weakens the dynasty's real foundation. It cuts him off from his roots.
And the ʿAsabiyyah just drains away.
It diminishes. Loyalty becomes transactional, not deeply felt. Soldiers become hirelings. The state loses its inner cohesion. And that makes the dynasty incredibly vulnerable.
Vulnerable to what?
To internal revolts, maybe from the alienated tribesmen, or to external attack from a new group on the fringes with strong, fresh ʿAsabiyyah. This often leads to the dynasty splitting into 2 or 3 weaker factions, or just being quickly wiped out altogether. And the cycle begins again.
It sounds so inevitable, almost deterministic.
It does have that feel.
Yeah.
And that's a point modern historians sometimes debate. Is it too neat, too fatalistic? Does it oversimplify the messy reality, the muddle and complexity of social phenomena?
What do you think?
I think it's important to see it not just as a rigid scientific law, but also as a moral and philosophical vision. It was deeply shaped by his world, by the severe disruptions and false hopes, plagued dynastic disputes that he witnessed constantly. His theory reflects the patterns he saw in the chaotic history unfolding around him.
A pattern born from observing collapse.
Yes, a powerful attempt to find order and meaning in that chaos.
It's clear he wasn't just describing history, he was analyzing it on a whole different level. This connects to his ideas about historiography, right? About how history should actually be written and studied.
Absolutely. For him, history wasn't just storytelling. It was, as we said, a science. ʿUmrān. And he was quite critical of the historians who came before him.
What was his criticism?
He felt they often confused things and mixed up cause and effect, couldn't distinguish general patterns from specific events or the individual from the universal. They repeated stories without checking if they were even plausible. The legendary and the credible got jumbled together.
So he wanted a more rigorous approach.
Definitely. He wanted to establish a normative method, a way to sift through historical information to distinguish right from wrong, or maybe more accurately, plausible from implausible.
How did he propose doing that? What was his method?
His core idea was to apply rules of logic onto history, to use reason and an understanding of how societies actually work to evaluate historical accounts.
Logic. How would that work in history?
He talked about distinguishing the underlying essential cause. He called it the mubtada, like ʿAsabiyyah being the mubtada for dynastic power, from the surface conditions or events, the khabar.
Like symptoms versus the underlying disease.
That's a great analogy. He wanted historians to look past the symptoms, khabar, to diagnose the root causes, mubtada. He also argued that historical truth isn't absolute certainty. He said veracity is only approximative and never compelling, except by virtue of its consensual acceptance.
So truth is more about plausibility and what makes sense collectively.
In a way, yes. Reducing truth to plausibility based on our understanding of social laws. But here's where it gets really interesting. It sounds incredibly modern.
Sure.
He insisted that a good historian needs a comprehensive knowledge of present conditions.
Knowledge of the present to understand the past.
Yes, so you can compare similarities or differences between the present and the past. You need to understand how human societies function now to judge if accounts of the past are believable.
That does sound very modern, like using social science to verify history.
Exactly. This was a major challenge to the dominant historical methods of his time. The prevailing approach, called Silmarijal, focused almost entirely on the chain of transmission.
Meaning, who told the story to whom? Verifying the sources.
Right. It was about the reliability of the narrators, which is important, of course. But Ibn Khaldun said that's not enough. You also have to ask, does the story itself make sense? Is it inherently plausible given what we know about human nature and social organization? He demanded critical evaluation of the content, not just the source.
That's a huge shift.
It really was. A move towards internal criticism and sociological plausibility.
And his own autobiography. You mentioned it was unusual. Does it reflect this approach?
In a way, yes. It was groundbreaking because it went so far beyond the typical Arab autobiographies of the time.
How were they typical?
Usually, they were quite formal lists of teachers, positions held, dates. But the author's actual personality often remained shrouded. They
Yeah.
neglected the personal aspects.
But Ibn Khaldun's was different.
Very different. It revealed his personality, gave glimpses into the internal workings of his mind. It showed his cunning, his initiative, his ambition. It wasn't just a CV. It was a self-portrait of him navigating his complex world.
So it showed the individual agent within the historical forces he described?
Exactly. It showed how he, this orphan who faced so much loss, rose to the highest offices, mainly on his own initiative. It's a fascinating look at individual agency interacting with the broader social currents he analyzed so brilliantly.
Okay, we've covered his life, his world, his core ideas. Now let's bring it home. What does all this 14th century thinking mean for you, listening right now in our totally different digital world? The relevance seems striking.
It really is, especially when you think about ʿAsabiyyah and state fragility. Those echoes are loud and clear.
Let's start with ʿAsabiyyah. How does that connect to today?
Well, remember that key insight we discussed, that ʿAsabiyyah doesn't have to be based on actual blood lineage.
Right. It can be the appearance or the feeling of a common lineage.
Exactly. Now, think about our world today. Think about online communities, social media tribes.
Ah, interesting.
These groups form intense loyalties, powerful group identities around shared interests, maybe political views, specific ideologies, even just shared fandoms, or, crucially, common enemies.
Often without any traditional blood ties at all.
Precisely. These are like virtual āsabiyyahs, and they can be incredibly powerful, right?
Yeah.
Influencing everything from what people buy to political mobilization to shaping public opinion, sometimes in very volatile ways.
That connection he made about common enemies, constructing a common lineage to solidify an alliance, that feels very familiar online.
Doesn't it? You see it constantly in online echo chambers. A shared enemy, a shared sense of grievance can forge a surprisingly strong, cohesive group identity, even among people who've never met. It's āsabiyyah for the digital age.
A bit chilling maybe, but a powerful lens. What about the state fragility side? How do his ideas apply there?
Well, think back to his cycle of decline, that phase where the ruler starts to alienate his original supporters, the core āsabiyyah group that brought him to power.
Yeah, and relies on outsiders, mercenaries.
Right, relying on other friends, not of his own kin. He saw that as fatally weakening the state. Now, this raises an important question for today. How many modern states around the world face deep internal fragility precisely because leaders marginalize their original power bases?
You mean leaders who forget or dismiss the groups who helped them get elected or who formed the initial revolutionary coalition?
Exactly. Or leaders who consolidate power by surrounding themselves only with narrow loyalists, often alienating broader segments of the population or traditional power structures. Ibn Khaldun's framework helps us analyze these cycles of political disunity, the coups, the civil conflicts, the constant struggle for central control that still affects so many regions.
It's like that pattern he saw in his own time, the severe political and social disruption just keeps repeating.
Sadly, yes. His 14th century analysis of dynastic decay provides a disturbingly relevant lens for understanding state weakness and collapse, even now. Hashtag tag 3.2, practical applications of his insights.
Beyond these big political dynamics, are there more sort of practical, everyday applications of his thinking? You mentioned public health earlier.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
His description of the Black Death, for instance, remembering that he linked it, at least partly, to urban overcrowding and decay.
Right, based on his own tragic experience.
Yes. And here's where it gets really striking for today. His detailed account of the plague's impact, the chaos, the breakdown of society. He even mentioned things like traffic jams of coffins in Cairo, bodies left in the streets.
Grim.
Very grim. But it's a stark, timeless reminder of how urban density and public health crises are intertwined. Think about our recent experiences with pandemics.
Definitely. All the debates about lockdowns, urban living, population density.
Exactly. How do densely packed cities cope? What are the vulnerabilities? He even noted specific economic impacts, like how the plague forced a Marinid army to abandon its campaign against Tunis because disease ravaged the troops. It's a direct line from his observations to challenges we still grapple with.
It really is. What about his ideas on rural versus urban? You mentioned innovation.
Yeah, this is a fascinating one. Remember his idea that rural civilization was the source, the reservoir of energy.
And that future or potential power paradoxically rested in those tribes farthest away from power, the hardy ones on the fringes.
Right. He admired their purity, power, and aggressive potential, seeing them as less corrupted by luxury. Now let's draw a parallel. So what does this mean in, say, the business world?
Okay.
Think about disruptive innovation. Does it usually come from the huge, established, luxurious corporations in the big city centers?
Often not. It often comes from startups, smaller companies.
Exactly. From the agile, hardy startups operating on the fringes, outside the established system. They have that initial toughness, that simplicity, maybe that intense early-stage āsabiyyah among the founding team.
And they can disrupt the sedentary culture of the big players.
Precisely. It's a compelling analogy. It suggests that maybe there's a danger in organizations getting too comfortable, too insulated, losing that initial dynamism and hunger. The energy often comes from the edges.
That's a really useful way to think about it. Now, what about that controversial point he made about scholars and politicians?
Ah, yes. His claim that scholars are, of all people, those least familiar with the ways of politics.
Which probably didn't make him popular with other scholars. Why did he say that?
He argued that scholars, by their nature, deal with abstractions, with general principles, universal ideas. They like to generalize. Politicians, however, have to deal with the messy facts of the outside world, with concrete situations, particular or practical problems.
Theory versus practice.
Essentially, politicians need pragmatic solutions, often compromises, that work now, even if they aren't perfectly logical or theoretically pure. He even warned that politicians could get infected by too much abstract scholarly thinking, losing touch with reality.
This makes you think, doesn't it, about the gap between academic knowledge and real-world leadership in almost any field.
It really does. It begs that question. How do you balance deep theoretical work, the kind of intellectual solitude he himself needed for the Muqaddimah, with the political engagement needed for actual impact?
He seemed to embody that tension himself, the scholar who was also deeply involved in politics, even if sometimes unsuccessfully.
Exactly. His own life, that contrast between his productive sabbatical writing retreat and his often frustrating political career, perfectly illustrates the dilemma he described.
Okay, let's zoom out one last time. How does Ibn Khaldun fit into broader philosophical conversations? Comparing his ideas to, say, dominant Western thought, his cyclical view of history seems like a major difference.
It's a fundamental difference. As we touched on, there's often a strong bias for urbanism as a superior form of human organization in Western thought, tracing back to Greece and Rome.
And that often comes with an idea of linear progress, right? History moving forward, upward.
Generally, yes.
Yeah.
An assumption of continuous development towards more complex, advanced urban societies. Ibn Khaldun completely disrupts that. His cyclical view, where rural civilization is the vital source, and urbanism inevitably leads to decay and the loss of āsabiyyah, it fundamentally challenges that linear, city-focused mindset. For him, history wasn't a straight lineup. It was this constant process of birth from a tribal seed, flourishing, decay, and then rebirth with another tribal dynasty emerging phoenix-like from the ashes.
So not progress, but cycles of regeneration and decline.
Exactly. Now, he wasn't maybe totally unique in valuing rural life. He acknowledged similar themes existed in popular culture elsewhere, but he gave it this deep sociological and philosophical grounding. It was a core part of his model.
What about the individual versus the collective? Western thought often emphasizes individual agency, rights, choices. Ibn Khaldun focused so much on the collective, on āsabiyyah.
He absolutely emphasized the collective āsabiyyah as the main engine of history. But here's where it gets nuanced and fascinating.
Yeah.
His own life. As we saw in his autobiography, he himself displayed an incredibly strong sense of individual agency.
The orphan who rose through his own initiative.
Right. He made choices, took risks, navigated treacherous situations through his own cunning and intellect. So while his theory highlights collective forces, his life shows the individual maneuvering within those forces.
So there's a tension there.
I think so. It raises a deep philosophical question about structure versus agency. He even explored Sufi ideas, which wrestled with similar problems, reconciling God's overarching will, that deterministic oneness, with the reality of individual consciousness and choice, a higher level of differentiation.
So it wasn't just simple determinism for him.
It seems more nuanced than that. This interplay between the individual and the collective, between choice and broader social tides, is actually a really profound aspect of his thought. And again, his very personal autobiography, so different from the impersonal chronicles of the time, underscores this focus on the individual's journey.
And finally, maybe his boldest claim for his era, his views on religion and society.
Yes, that was quite radical. He essentially argued that formal religious law was not necessary for a functioning human society to emerge.
Not necessary. In the 14th century Islamic world, that sounds borderline heretical.
He was certainly pushing boundaries. He believed societies could organize themselves, establish order, and thrive based on laws other than those set forth in Orthodox Islam. How? Primarily through that natural force of group feeling, through ʿAsabiyyah.
So solidarity itself could provide the basis for social order, even without divine law.
That's what he suggested. This contrasted sharply with many of his contemporaries, who saw religious law as the only thing holding society together, the only restraint against chaos.
So he had a more sociological view.
Exactly, a more sociological, less purely theological understanding of how human groups organize themselves. He recognized the practical power of human solidarity, the mechanics of governance, as forces in their own right, existing alongside, and sometimes independent of, formal religious structures. It was a remarkably pragmatic and analytical perspective for his time. #tag outro.
Wow. What an incredible journey through the life and mind of Ibn Khaldun. It's just staggering how much insight one person could pack into a lifetime, especially one lived amidst so much turmoil.
He truly was extraordinary, a unique thinker.
We've covered so much today, his dramatic life shaping his ideas, the core concepts of ʿAsabiyyah and ʿUmrān, that compelling cyclical view of history, his revolutionary approach to studying the past, and maybe most importantly, how these centuries-old ideas still give us such powerful tools to understand our own world, from online tribes and social media dynamics.
With the fragility of modern state.
You even thinking about urban health or where innovation comes from, it's incredibly rich.
It really is. And I think if there's one final thought to leave listeners with, it's how Ibn Khaldun forces us to look beneath the surface.
Beyond just the events.
Yes. To understand the logic of history, the underlying forces that shape societies. His constant focus on that competitive race for elusive power, this idea that power is never static, never permanently held.
Right, that constant cycle.
It leads to a really profound, maybe unsettling question he leaves us with. If power is ultimately transient, if it can never be truly held onto, what then should be the real goal? What should human societies, what should we actually strive for within any civilization, if not just the temporary grip on power?
That is a deep question to ponder. What is the point if the cycle just continues? A very provocative thought to end on.
Indeed.
Well, thank you for guiding us through this fascinating deep dive. And thank you, our listener, for joining us on this exploration of Ibn Khaldun's enduring wisdom.
It was a pleasure.
We hope this gives you a new lens to look at the world. We encourage you to keep digging, keep asking questions, and maybe use some of Ibn Khaldun's framework to make sense of the complex patterns unfolding around you.